When Walpole came with the news of his father's death, George II appears to have regarded it as a wind-up. "That is one big lie." But the outcast prince was indeed now George II, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, Elector of Hanover, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg and Duke of Celle. When he'd been convinced, he came here to Leicester Square. At the time it was Leicester House, where he'd been running his own court. And here he was attended by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who formally presented him with his father's will. Royal wills had once been the most powerful documents in the world. When William the Conqueror and Henry II died, their wills established who would rule after them. George took his father's will and, instead of opening it, shoved it in his pocket. It was never seen again, to the great disappointment of his father's mistresses. George II's wife, Queen Caroline, had very firm ideas on what should happen next, and her husband was quite obedient. The result was that everyone who'd been hoping for their own promotion in a changed government was disappointed. Walpole remained Prime Minister. He'd promised her that she would get a personal grant of £100,000 a year, double the offer his opposition came up with, and very little actually changed at all. That included the traditional hostility between anyone called King George and his son. The son in question was now, of course, the son of George II, Prince Frederick. According to Queen Caroline, he was
the greatest ass, the greatest liar, the greatest canaille, and the greatest beast in the whole world, and we heartily wish he was out of it.
She would have said it in German. George agreed with the Queen and refused to allow Frederick to marry Princess Wilhelmina of Prussia on the entirely sensible grounds that
I did not think that engrafting my half-witted coxcomb upon a mad woman would improve the breed.
Prince Frederick's view of his father was, by contrast, quite balanced and objective. He's an obstinate, self-indulgent, miserly martinet with an insatiable sexual appetite. Obstinate? Yes. Self-indulgent? A fair point. Miserly? Well, he had slashed Frederick's allowance to make him less of a social rival. Martinet? Well, certainly a man of relentless and determined regular routine. And the sexual appetite? We assumed that as his right. For instance, he began seriously lusting after the beautiful young wife of the Count of Walmoden when he met her in Hanover in 1735, and he told the Queen that
You must love the Walmoden, for she loves me.
The popular view of the king was that he was a randy buffoon. He seems to have been flattered by the jokes about his sexual efforts. As his father had once done, Frederick ran his own alternative court, which was far more popular than the king's. King George II didn't like that.
Mein Gott, popularity always makes me sick, but this makes me vomit.
The pair of them even patronized rival operatic outfits. The king and his entourage went to see Handel at the Haymarket. Handel had written George's coronation anthems. His music was grand and glorious, altogether suitable for magnifying the greatness of a self-important royal personage. The prince and his crowd stayed away. They went instead to the Theatre Royal in Lincoln's Inn Fields. That was where opera was being transformed into popular musical theatre. The biggest hit was The Beggar's Opera, a vigorous tale of the criminal classes which lots of people said was intended as a satire on the court and Walpole's government.
When you censure the age, be cautious and sage, lest the courtiers offended should be. If you mention vice or bribe, 'tis so pat to all the tribe, each cries, that was levelled at me.
It was all very entertaining, watching royalty playing out their family quarrels, but they were not quite reduced to the level of powerless performers. King George was a fighting man, like his father, head of the army, and very much engaged in the quarrels between the rulers of continental Europe. Walpole tried hard to keep him out of wars, but in 1739 the king got his way and England went to war with Spain. This was the start of a steadily growing involvement in the power struggle between France, Prussia and the Habsburg Empire. Its culmination for George came in June 1743. He found himself under attack by the French at a German village called Dettingen. His horse bolted, but George stood in front of his troops, waved his sword and made a rather ponderous but actually rather brave little speech.
Now, boys, now for the honor of England. Fire and behave bravely, or the French will soon run.
And so he became the last English king to lead his troops in battle. It was a fierce fight, and George emerged a bit of a hero. But he didn't rule the country. Governments and ministers came and went not because he wanted them, but because Parliament wanted them. In fact, George called himself a prisoner on the throne. In 1745, he played no part in the battles of Prestonpans or Culloden, which were far more important to the throne than the Battle of Dettingen. After all, they were battles for the throne itself. Bonnie Prince Charlie to his supporters, Charles Casimir was 25 years old, pale, thin, romantic and brave. And he decided that George was so unpopular it would be a doddle to take over. He turned up at his own expense in the Hebrides and summoned the Scottish clans. Most of them responded, but out of a combination of loyalty and desperation rather than conviction. But things went rather well for the rebels. They were enthusiastically welcomed into Edinburgh and roundly defeated the government army at Prestonpans. The news created a passion of patriotism when it reached London. The city might have lampooned the court and sneered at it, but this was different. That evening the king was visiting the theatre, the King's Theatre, Drury Lane, and the orchestra struck up a tune which they'd just got hold of.
God save a gracious king, long live a noble king, God save the king.
The audience loved it. None of them knew that it had been the Old Pretender's music, or the King of France's. The song had changed sides and became the national anthem. Actually, it became everybody's anthem at one time or another. Frenchmen, Germans, Russians, Swiss, Liechtensteiners, Swedes, Danes and Americans have all swelled with patriotic pride to exactly the same tune. But when God Save the King became London's big hit, it was because no one could see how the king would be saved any other way. Marshal Wade, the best officer in the government army, said that Scotland was lost and England would fall prey to the first comer.
Lord, grant that Marshal Wade may by thy mighty aid victory bring. May he sedition hush, and like a torrent rush, rebellious Scots to crush. God save the King.
The rebels took Manchester, then Derby. London trembled, but not as much as the clansmen. They'd marched expecting England to rise in their support and the French to invade. Instead, they had no support at all. Most fundamentally, they realized that the English would never accept a Roman Catholic king. They'd outflanked a large English army, but it was now on their tail, and another was coming up from London. So back they went, and the clansmen were finally slaughtered in their thousands at Culloden in April 1746. Charles hid out for months in the Scottish Islands, hunted through the mountains by troops and with a price on his head, but protected by tribal loyalties until he finally escaped back to France. And the clan culture of the Highlands was systematically and ruthlessly extirpated. Clans were dispersed, their leaders imprisoned or executed, plaid and weaponry and bagpipes were banned. The would-be Charles III made a bizarre secret return to England in 1750, where he converted to Protestantism and expected this would encourage his supporters to have more hope. They were more impressed by his degree of attachment to the bottle. Not so much the king over the water as the king under the table. King George was in no danger now. George also found his other great enemy removed. His son Frederick died in 1751. He'd been hit hard in the stomach by a tennis ball, and the resulting abdominal ulcer burst and killed him. The new heir to the throne was a 12-year-old child, Frederick's son, George. But the great problems of the kingdom were outside the king's grasp. His country was now a great imperial trading power, with huge involvements in India, the East Indies, North America, and the Mediterranean. So was France. At the same time, continental Europe was constantly boiling over into war, and Hanover was in the middle of that. In 1756, the great powers finally locked horns in a do-or-die struggle that would girdle the whole world. This would become the 7 Years' War. It was truly the First World War. Britain fought in the name of its king, but that king now neither directed policy nor took part in the battles. A new world. In fact, affairs were so far out of the king's control that when he dismissed ministers he didn't like, they came right back again. So far as the English were concerned, this was just how things ought to be. Englishmen were entitled to liberty. The despots were on the other side, Catholic France and Austria. Their whole life, commerce, industry, and fighting force was directed by royal tyrants who ruled over starving and powerless peasants. And on the other side, Protestant Britain, whose commerce was run by men of business, whose industry was directed by free tradesmen, whose army and navy were run by heroes and manned by proud free men, and whose court was the centre of society, not of autocratic power. And that was how many of the British really did see it. Of course, they were also fighting on the side of despotic Prussia, but that was a minor detail. The general perception was that this was a war of free Britons against European despots. Poor George died at the height of the war in 1760, and it didn't matter at all.